So anyway, at this point, we're in the Prohibition area around 1922. There's this guy, Jim Newton. He's another of these successful businessmen who has a good reputation, or at least had a good reputation, has had a lot of success in life, a high education, but when it comes to his drinking, he's completely powerless and has no idea how to stop, And he sees these two women all dressed up and going into this back alley door, and he presumes that it's a speakeasy. And he follows them, thinking, Jim also is kind of known for being a bit of a fan of women, and so he thinks that he's going to go find himself a date. And it turns out he accidentally stumbles upon an Oxford group meeting that these women were going to, and he ends up staying. And he ends up sort of practicing some of the principles and actions from the Oxford group, and he gets sober. And he ends up having a role in getting future people sober in the Oxford group that eventually would connect with Bill Wilson, co-founder of AA. Another sort of important development around 1931, 1933, a gentleman named Roland Hazard. Now, Roland wasn't actually a member of AA, but he was an alcoholic, and this is another guy. He was a scion from a wealthy family in Rhode Island. They were involved in all sorts of manufacturing and agriculture industry. He was a Yale graduate. His brother or cousin had won a Nobel Prize or Pulitzer Prize, something very esteemed along those lines. And he himself had briefly served as a senator. So again, comes from a very connected and powerful politically, financial family. He himself had the best money. He could buy the best doctors with the money and influence he had, to help cure his alcoholism. And nothing worked. So he ends up going to around, some of the things I've read, the dates kind of differ, but we know it's somewhere around 1931. With his finances and his contacts, is able to visit Dr. Carl Jung in Zurich, Switzerland. If you haven't heard of Dr. Jung, he's probably considered the second most influential, sort of iconic psychologist in the history of time, next to Sigmund Freud. And I believe he was even an apprentice of Dr. Freud. And Jung actually has a pretty good understanding, at least, of the solution of alcoholism. And we'll get to that in a second. And Roland goes to visit him for the first time because of his uncontrollable drinking and all the problems it's bringing into his life. And he learns so much from the doctor. He even talks about it in, they call him a certain businessman, a certain American businessman in the AA Big Book on page 26 in the 4th edition. And they're talking about Roland here. And it says in the middle of page 26, and this is talking about Roland, above all, he believed he had acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner workings of his mind and its hidden springs that relapse was unthinkable. Nevertheless, he was drunk in a short time. More baffling still, he could not give himself a satisfactory explanation for his fall. So Roland goes out there to Switzerland, visits Dr. Jung, learns all this stuff about the, as he says, the inner workings of his mind, and he gets struck with that overconfidence that a lot of us get, especially our first time in treatment. And he's basically goes back to the States. I'm never going to drink again. I got this. And he doesn't, within 30 days, he's drinking again. And so he actually goes back and visits Dr. Jung a second time. And this visit's much more documented in the Big Book, also in that 26 to 28 page range. And, he admired this doctor a lot, and he begs him, beseeches him, why can't I recover? And he says he begged the doctor to tell him the whole truth, and he got it. In the doctor's judgment, he was utterly hopeless. He could never regain his position in society, and he would have to place himself under lock and key or hire a bodyguard if he expected to live long. That was a great physician's opinion. So think about that for a second. When we talked earlier about how there was very little solution available to people, And to be a chronic alcoholic was akin to a death or prison sentence, because basically you'd either die an alcoholic death because there was no other recourse, or you just get arrested enough on petty crimes related to the drinking that they'd eventually just lock you up in a criminal asylum and throw away the key, or a mental asylum. And so this great influential book, or doctor that's had all these books written about him and published all these great works himself, tells him your only hope as a chronic alcoholic is to basically lock yourself up in a room with somebody outside the door guarding it, to make sure that nobody gets in and out so that you can't get alcohol. That was the hopelessness of the situation, and that says a lot. But Jung does still have something to offer. And he says, this is coming from Jung, he says, "You have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I have never seen one single case recover where that state of mind existed to the extent that it does in you." This is Dr. Jung talking to Roland. Our friend felt as though the gates of hell had closed in on him with acclaim. And so Roland says, "Is there any exception?" And Dr. Jung sort of hesitantly says, "Yes, there is." And it's referenced here in the book. It says, exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomena. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely set of new conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. In fact, I have been trying to produce some such emotional arrangement in you. So Dr. Jung calls these experiences, these what we'll call, I guess, spiritual awakenings, to use recovery language, big book language. He calls them a phenomenon, And you think about that word, and what do you normally think of when you hear the word phenomenon? To me, I think of like X-Files or something extraterrestrial or paranormal, basically something that the human mind does not easily comprehend. Most normal people don't understand. And that's sort of how rare and inexplicable these spiritual experiences are that Jung sees once in a while in people, where just all of their values, their thought processes, their ability to handle situations in life is completely transformed, sort of for the better. And so he basically tells Jung, Roland kind of hears that, and he's like, "Oh, great, well, I'm, an upstanding member of my church, I'm a host on Sundays, I go every week, and that kind of thing. I donate all sorts of money to the church, I'm good." And Roland warns him, most of the time, he's like, what you need is a vital spiritual experience, but most of the time this does not come through a church or a religion. All right, and so with that, Roland's not really sure what to do with it. But what Jung's talking about is, again, some of these spiritual principles, these themes that we've seen, as we've been talking so far, and that we'll see as we continue to talk about this stuff, going out and listing the people you've harmed, making amends or restitution to them, sort of surrendering your will, being of service, giving back. As an alcoholic, you've taken enough, or an addict, you've taken enough, now it's your turn to give back and sort of balance that ledger. And that's the kind of sort of spiritual prescription that Jung's talking about here. Roland thinks, immediately that it's just a matter of, going to church and, being there for an hour on Sundays. So he ends up having something at least to work with, going back to the States, but he still struggles for several years. He's not really taking the spiritual prescription seriously. And finally he ends up joining up with the local Oxford group, working that program, where they have a lot of the same actions that we hear about later in the 12 steps. And he starts doing some of this stuff, the service, the practice in honesty, and making restitution, and he ends up getting sober. And so it's a pretty cool story with Roland there. Meanwhile, so a lot of this is happening on the East Coast, and a lot of these people kind of run into each other because they run in the same social circles. They summer in some of the same places. And over in Akron, Ohio, there's this lady, Henrietta Sieberling, and she works for the Firestone estate. She has a little cottage there where the big Firestone mansion is for the tire manufacturers. If you've ever visited Founders Day or something, you probably know what I'm talking about. They have it in June every year in Akron to celebrate sort of the birth of AA. And anyway, Henrietta is attending the Oxford group. She's married to an attorney in town there, also a successful man, but she's so caught up in her marital problems. It's all she can think about, it's all she talks about. And she goes to the Oxford group and starts realizing that there's more to life than her marital problems. There's other things she can be doing to feel useful, to feel better about her life, her place on this planet. And she has a good friend named Dr. Robert Holcomb Smith, who we all affectionately know as Dr. Bob, one of the co-founders of AA. And in this sort of 1933 to 35 range, Dr. Bob is a surgeon at the hospital, Akron University Hospital, and he's gotten to the point where he needs to drink before he performs surgery just to keep a steady hand. And she talks about, they're all just, at these Oxford group meetings, they're all just waiting for Dr. Bob to admit that he's an alcoholic, and he just won't do it. He thinks he has, like many of us alcoholics, addicts, we think that we're pulling the wool over everybody's eyes, but people, they know the truth, and it's the same situation with Dr. Bob. He just wants to talk about, the dog that ran away the night before, or something going on at the hospital. He's not admitting his problem with alcohol. And Henrietta writes in her journal, she talks about being one of the first to pray for the alcoholic and praying for God to bring somebody into Dr. Bob's life to help him with his drinking problem. So as we get to 1934 here, we have this gentleman, Yale Thatcher. Yale, if you've seen the movie My Name is Bill W., he's the character that Gary Sinise played. He was a longtime friend of Bill Wilson, and Yale and Bill Wilson, co-founder of AA, rode the wave of Wall Street heights, in the roaring 20s, and went through the stock market, crashed together every night, in the bars, drinking together after, working hard, playing hard, just childhood friends. And he is swirling the drain. He is literally on the verge of being committed to, criminal asylum for the rest of his life because of his uncontrollable alcoholism. And, this guy's gone from the height of Wall Street to can't find a job anywhere. And he ends up some friends to get him a job just painting some lady's house. That's the only, and even then they're reluctant to give him that job. And they tell him, no matter what, you can't drink on the job. And being a good alcoholic, he promises that he won't, but of course he does, right? And the story goes, he ends up crashing one of those 1930s tank cars, in through the woman's kitchen. And whether it's true or not, I don't know, but according to some versions of the story, he stumbles out and asks her if she's got any coffee, as she's terrified, up against the wall because her kitchen's just been driven through by one of these big iron cars. And that's kind of probably the last straw for him. And he ends up going in front of the judge. Jim Newton and Roland and some other members of the Oxford group actually convinced the judge. They talked to the judge about how their life's been transformed by this Oxford group and working that program, and sort of explain some of the ways, where the depths that they've been to, and that they're sober now. And they actually convinced the judge to let them work with Yale. So he's really given a reprieve from being locked up for the rest of his life. And Yale gets about 2 months sober working the Oxford group program. And he says, I need to bring this to the most self-destructive and harmless drinker I know, to William Griffith Wilson. So he's talking about Bill W. there. And this is chronicled in Bill's story in the big book. Around page 8, they talk about, Bill says he gets a call from an old friend. He's talking about Ebby who wants to come visit. And Bill himself is at his own bottom. He's been to Towns Hospital, you know, to dry out. Again, they didn't have treatment then, so we can't really say he went to treatment, but he went to the hospital for, you know, to be strapped to a bed, you know, and treated by Dr. William Silkworth. Three previous occasions, he's moved his mattress from the upper level down to the basement for fear that he'd jump out a window in alcoholic deliriums. He hasn't held down a job in a long time. His wife is, you know, making all the income, working at a department store, which was, you know, much more taboo back in that day. He's burned every bridge. Nobody wants to give him a chance. Nobody wants anything to do with him, including his in-laws, Lois, his wife, Lois, his parents are pretty much disgusted with him. He's disgusted with himself at this point. And so his old friend's going to come, and what does Bill immediately think of? Well, you know, let's relive the glory days, you know, get the rum bottle out, and he's even prepared for that. And he's sitting at the kitchen table with 2 glasses, the rum bottle right in the middle. And he talks about how it's actually what happens is Ebby calls and talks to Lois, and she's the one that invites him over. And Bill answers the door, and he even says in Bill's story, you know, there stood my friend, fresh-skinned and glowing. He was sober, you know, but while he's sort of admiring this in a way, he's also like, you know, cynical about it. And he's like, oh, he's probably found religion, some kind of, you know, God crackpot at this point. And Ebby does tell him that he's found religion and starts trying to talk to him about this Oxford group solution. Ebby's there basically working a 12-step. You know, he's 12-stepping Bill to try and get him into this Oxford group program because he knows how far down Bill is, and Ebby himself was just there a couple months ago. And it's not so much documented in Bill's story, but from everything I've read, from what I've read, they butt heads on this God thing. So Bill's tolerating, you know, somewhat, you know, maybe sarcastically or sort of cynically in his own mind, you know, Ebby talking about this Oxford group program and how it's people helping each other with their problems, and there's alcoholics in the groups who can relate to one another and help each other, and we go out and do things together, sober, and support each other, and that all sounds fine. But then they start talking about this God business, right? And they butt heads about it. And if you know anything about Bill Wilson, he's, you know, going to fancy himself the smartest guy in any room, and he's got to have the last word. And you know, so, and he's also was a lieutenant in World War I, so he's seen trench warfare at firsthand, up close, the advent of the machine gun, the tank, you know, the barbed wire, no man's land, just all the grisly mud and blood and horror of World War I. And so it's difficult for him to believe this sort of benevolent, loving God who's kind of at the center of things. He even says in the story, you know, he's not as, you know, he's not full-blown atheist. He does believe that, you know, he said it'd be crazy to think, you know, that there's nothing at the root of anything, you know, just looking at sort of the universe, you know, there has to be some kind of creative intelligence, but that's as far as he's really ever gotten with it, you know. But this idea of this, you know, sort of loving, caring God in the sky is just ridiculous to him. And he even says, but I know there's a devil, and he's got his grips on me pretty good. So actually, Ebby comes back a second time, and they start arguing about this God stuff again. And Bill kicks him out a second time, just doesn't want to hear it. Bill just wants to get him drunk. He even says, you know, and that's what alcoholics, you know, that's what we do, you know. Misery loves company, right? So he sees his buddy doing well, looking healthy, as he says, fresh-skinned and glowing. And the first thing he does is pass a drink to him. You know, Ebby says no. Says no over and over. So Ebby ends up coming back a third time with Sieber Graves, and depending what account you read, possibly Jim Newton too. I'm not sure about that. There's no consensus that I've been able to find, but he does bring some some other people with more experience in the Oxford group to sort of help with this 12-step, which is a good way to practice this 12-step, bringing more experienced people with you. You know, there they get again, talking about higher power, talking about God. What ends up being is, Ebby basically says, it's written in the book, like, you know, my friend says, you know, why don't you choose your own conception of God? But really, it's probably more like, damn it, I'm tired of arguing about this, just choose your own friggin' conception of God. Let's just get past this thing. You know, we gotta move on, get past this God blockade that we have. And even, you know, Bill even says, my friend did no preaching, did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. That was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. So that's Bill relaying his experience with Ebby, and Ebby getting help by the two people in the Oxford group. Finally, Bill hears this. Choose your own conception of God. And he says, that statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had stood and shivered for years. I stood in the sunlight at last. And right here he ends up working a perfect second step without even realizing there are no steps yet, but he works a perfect second step right here on page 12. He says, it was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. All right? So we talk about recovery, AA as a program of attraction. You know, somebody has something you want, and that's exactly what Bill's talking about here. He sees something that his friend has, and he wants it, and he's going to go for it too.